Okay, everybody, we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Ken Wise. I'm with the Cornell IPM Integrated Pest Management Program. I am the livestock coordinator for New York State for IPM. We developed this series of webinars for the winter, and this is kind of like the first time we've done this, so it's kind of exciting. Our speaker today will be Dr. Bryony Sands from the University of Vermont. She is the assistant professor of livestock integrated pest management, has done a ton of work with dung beetles and ecological pasture management type research. Um, and she's going to give us a talk today on integrated pest management for grazing dairies. With that, I'll let you take over there.
Thanks, Ken. Yeah, so I work on integrated pest management for sort of the pasture ecosystem. This talk is focused on work that we've done with grazing, dairy, and beef. So I basically look at what pests and parasites we find in a pasture ecosystem and how we can manage them, whilst also considering other organisms, such as beneficial insects like dung beetles, that live in the pasture ecosystem too. So this is just a quick overview of what we're going to cover today. I will go over the main pests and parasites that we find in grazed pastures. This talk is focusing on external pests and parasites, so flies, ticks, and lice. Next week, we're going to talk more about internal parasites, so things like worms and coccidia. Um, and then I'm going to talk a bit about the what and why of IPM. So what is it and why should we be thinking about it? And within that, I will talk a bit more about dung beetles and beneficial insects. And then for the last part of the talk, I will go over some of the results from our research that we've been doing on pest flies, ticks and lice over the past sort of 4 to 5 years. Much of this work is in collaboration with Ken and Hannah at Cornell. So I'm excited to share some of that with you. So the pasture ecosystem is made up of many interconnected parts. So obviously plants, animals, soil, and sunlight are all interacting in that system. And the animals are not just the livestock, but the insects, the birds, and the other wild animals that might be living in that system. And the connectivity of all of those parts is important because it means what we do to one of those parts is going to impact all of the other parts. So, for example, how I manage the livestock does have impacts on the insects, the plants, and the soil. And that's really what we mean when we talk about integrated management. So integrated pest and parasite management is management for pests and parasites that considers this ecosystem as a whole. So these are the pests and parasites that we find out in the pasture ecosystem. As I said, today we're just going to be focusing on the things on the right side of that slide. So the pest flies that we find in pastures, ticks, and then I will talk about lice. Lice are more of an issue over winter when animals are in housing, but obviously most animals in the northeast are in housing in winter, and lice sort of carry the population does occur when they're out on pasture just at a much lower level. And we've done some interesting research on sort of sustainable lice control. So thinking about all things being interconnected, I just wanted to take a moment to zoom in on the dung ecosystem. So obviously, many pests and parasites are transmitted through manure on the pasture. So that's sort of the nuisance organisms that I was mentioning, so pest flies, parasitic nematodes, so worms of cattle, for example. They have part of their life cycle that depends on the dung patties, and they're transmitted through the dung on the pasture. However, there's also a whole host of other beneficial organisms that live in a manure pat. So there's all sorts of insects, worms, bacteria, fungi that live there. I'm just going to focus on the insects. And so we have coprophagous insects that live in the manure, and that means that they eat the manure, they live there, and they breed in it. And they're very important in terms of decomposition, so processing that dung and bringing those nutrients back down into the soil. And then we have predatory beneficial organisms, things like predatory beetles that live in the dung patty. And they are very important because while they don't eat the dung itself, they will sort of go around hunting other insects that are living and developing in the manure, such as pest fly larvae, for example. So they're really important in terms of sort of natural suppression and regulation of pest and parasite populations on pastures. And then finally, we have sort of ecosystem engineers. Earthworms are obviously very important for nutrient cycling on pastures. And then we have our dung beetles. So dung beetles have a really important role in dung decomposition. They will physically move the dung from the pasture surface down into the soil, making tunnels and bringing it down below ground. So that has a very important role in sort of bringing all those important nutrients and organic matter down into the soil and getting rid of that breeding ground for pests and parasites too. So we'll talk a bit more about beneficial insects later in the talk. So I'm just going to go over sort of the main pests and parasites. Firstly, looking at pest flies out on pastures. So we have horn flies. They are the flies that you will see on sort of the side and the back and sort of in hot weather on the belly of the animal. They are biting flies, so that means that they're blood feeding. They're quite small. They're sort of probably the smallest one that you would see. And they can transmit mastitis. They obviously have a damaging economic impact because they're taking all of those blood meals and sort of constantly bothering the livestock. So then we have face flies. These are non-biting flies. As you can see from this picture, they're quite a bit bigger. They're about twice as big as horn flies. And they will just be generally found on the face, feeding on mucus and secretions from the eyes and the nose. They might also feed on sort of wounds on other areas of the animal. And they are known for transmitting pink eye between animals. And then finally, we have stable flies. These are more of a problem when animals are in housing, but we do find them out on the pasture, so I wanted to include them here. Again, those ones are biting flies, so they're feeding on blood. They're generally found on the legs, on the lower legs, and they can also transmit mastitis and other diseases. They will be more likely to breed in sort of bedding and manure rather than fresh dung. That's why they're more associated with housing. Face flies and horn flies will breed in very fresh dung, sort of as soon as the animal goes, they'll sort of hop on there and start breeding. Face flies can be more difficult to control than horn flies because horn flies will spend their entire life pretty much on the animal. Whereas face flies will visit the animal to feed, and then they will spend quite a significant proportion of their life sort of away from the animals, resting on vegetation in the pasture area. So they're kind of a bit harder to target with our products because they're not sort of always on the animal. So then looking at ticks that we might find, I'm gonna talk a bit about ticks in this webinar, but not going to go into too much detail because there's another webinar later in the series. Dr. Cassandra Olds is going to present in more detail on ticks. I'm just going to talk about 3 tick species that we found in our work here in Vermont and New York State. There are obviously other tick species that you might find in the Northeast. So yeah, just bear that in mind when I'm talking. So first we have the black-legged tick, or you might have heard it called the deer tick. It's very common. It's the one that transmits Lyme disease. So that's native to the US. It's the females that will engorge on the hosts. So by engorge, I mean when they take that massive blood meal and swell up. The males don't do that. They feed very sparingly. So they feed much less for less time and less often. And that's because the female needs to lay eggs, and it needs to take a really big blood meal before it can lay eggs, and they lay hundreds of eggs at a time. So that's why it's the female that sort of swells up like that and then drops off and prepares to lay the eggs. They have a wide range of hosts, from livestock to humans, deer, obviously, and small mammals as well. And they're obviously very important in terms of livestock and public health because, as I mentioned, they transmit Lyme disease, as well as anaplasmosis. The other common tick species that we find in pastures, in and around pastures, is the American dog tick. That's also native to the US. Again, the females engorge, the males don't. And they can prefer medium-sized hosts, so pets and humans, although they will also attach to livestock. And they transmit Rocky Mountain spotted fever, as well as anaplasmosis in cattle. And then finally, the Asian longhorn tick. This is an invasive species. It was first found in the US in 2017 in New Jersey. And so this tick is interesting because the females can reproduce without a male. So they do not need to breed. They can just lay viable eggs and reproduce without the presence of a male. So the majority of the ticks that we find are females of this species. They have livestock and wildlife as their host, but they do seem to have a preference for cattle. Again, they are of concern at the moment because, firstly, of being invasive, and secondly, they spread Theileria and Babesia into our livestock. Just wanted to show you what the fully engorged tick looks like, and this is what you'd be looking for on an animal. So yeah, it looks like these big grey sort of blobs on the cow. I'm sure you've all seen an engorged tick anyway. Yeah, so moving on to lice. As I mentioned, the populations of lice really explode in the winter when the animals are brought in from the pastures and put together in housing. The chewing louse is the most common. It's sort of reddish brown, and it's found along the midline, the back, the withers and the rump of the animal. This is not blood sucking. It just kind of feeds on like skin secretions and scrapes the skin. But because of that behavior, it does cause intense itching and hair loss in cattle. So that is something to look out for, sort of bald patches from scratching. The other type of louse that we see are sucking lice, and there's 3 species of sucking lice that we find. So this one is the long-nosed cattle louse. It really infests young stock quite heavily. Again, it's found on sort of the back midline, the neck, the rump, and the dewlap. The other sucking louse is the little blue cattle louse, which is the one that's found on the face, the jaw, and around the eyes. So you can sometimes see very heavy infestations around the eyes of cattle, and that is this smaller blue cattle louse. And then finally, the short-nosed cattle louse, that's the largest one. It's about 2 to 3 millimeters. So lice are pretty small. That's found mostly on the withers, the dewlap, and the brisket, although it can be widespread across the body in heavy infestations. And these sucking lice appear to be blue or black in color, and that is because they feed on blood. They sort of have piercing mouth parts in order to suck the blood. And that's why they look blue or black, because they're filled with blood, basically. So obviously that can cause a lot of issues in livestock, anemia, abortion, reduced weight and milk. And again, the saliva of those can cause allergic reactions. So they can also cause severe itching and hair loss. I just wanted to show you what it looks like when you would see it on an animal. Lice are always close to the skin because they're feeding at the skin surface. So in order to sort of see if you have lice, I would advise parting the hair and then looking where at the level of the skin, because they're not going to be sort of at the ends of the hair. So this first picture on the left shows chewing lice. You can see the arrow pointing to the adult, that's that sort of yellowish brown, stripy looking thing. And then the whiter ovoids there are eggs. And in heavy infestations, you would see a lot of eggs. So all of these little white blobs, and then the adult lice would be feeding closer to the skin. And then in the middle picture, you can see the sucking lice look much darker because they're filled with blood. So they can be a little easier to see. And as I mentioned, they can cause these characteristic patches of hair loss on animals. Okay, so that was sort of the pests and parasites that we might find. Now I wanted to move on to talk a little bit about what IPM is and why we want to use it, and yeah, focus on beneficial insects as well. So IPM for livestock is a sustainable decision-making process that uses information on pest and parasite biology, as well as livestock biology and the environment, so that whole ecosystem, to manage pests and parasites in a way that first and foremost prevents unacceptable damage to livestock, secondly, minimizes the risk to people, animals, and the environment, and then importantly, reduces the evolution of resistance to our treatments. So that is sort of a key benefit of stopping overuse of insecticidal treatments, is that it will help to slow resistance as well, and really sort of preserve the treatments for when we really need to use them. So this slide sort of outlines what common practice might look like for treating pests and parasites of grazing livestock. So this is not based on IPM. It's based on sort of calendar treatments throughout the grazing period based on when we might find pests and parasites popping up. So again, for this talk, just focus on the top of there with the external pests and parasites. So we have sort of lice in the winter. And then as we get into the spring, we'll find ticks out in pastures. And then obviously pest fly season is more over the summer. And then ticks pop back up again in the fall. And then we have lice again as we go into winter. And these are sort of the various treatments that we might be using over this time period in order to control these various pests and parasites. As you can see, there's quite a lot of treatments here based off sort of the calendar method. And this could be perceived as sort of the simplest and easiest way of controlling pests and parasites. It's sort of safe and effective. I guess you know that the pests and parasites are coming, so we may as well treat them. However, it's not necessarily true that that is the most cost-effective way, at least. We know that when we think about parasite biology, about 80% of parasites are found in just 20% of the herd. So it's not necessarily true that if we have one animal that has a heavy lice burden, for example, that means that the whole herd needs treating. We will usually find that there are animals that have high burdens of pests and parasites, but they are not the majority in the herd. So thinking about this sort of parasite biology 80-20 rule, treating the entire herd at once with these treatments, just based off of the month that it is in the year, is not really the most cost-effective way to manage them. So thinking about solutions and from an IPM approach, what management might look like. So really, we want to be thinking about scouting, monitoring and diagnostics so that we know what is actually going on, instead of just thinking, oh, it's winter, there's probably lice. So this really relies on checking your animals, getting out there, seeing if there are lice, ticks or flies present, using like evidence before you treat. I mentioned doing lice checks, so just parting bits of the hair and checking for lice. When we're thinking about pest flies, we can sort of also obviously look for their presence, but also think about economic thresholds or action thresholds. So there has been various work done showing sort of the level of economic injury from the population of flies, and that's going to be different based on what is acceptable to you on your farm. But you know, if we have below these thresholds, then we don't necessarily need to treat. Yeah, so treating only when necessary, using less harmful products. This sort of red to yellow scale shows various different insecticide products, and that they are known to have different impacts on the environment. So there are some products, as you can see, doramectin and ivermectin, which are known to be more toxic. And then other choices further down, things like moxidectin, so that would be Cydectin, is the brand name, that's known to be less environmentally damaging. So we can think about which products we're actually using. And then obviously alternative products, things like essential oils, and mechanical and biological control, so traps, and things like natural enemies. And we'll go into more detail about these methods a bit later on. So clinical disease in animals is usually avoided by using these various veterinary treatments. And these treatments are very good at controlling parasites, but there are some issues with this common sort of calendar-based treatment strategy. Firstly, the development of resistance. So obviously, we know that regular treatments of the whole herd is going to build up resistance in those pest and parasite populations. It's a big issue with internal parasites like worms, but we also see resistant populations of flies. There's work showing that there's fly populations in New York State which are resistant to the common pyrethroid fly treatments. So that's things like Ultrabos. So this is an issue that's getting sort of more and more urgent. Secondly, reduced immunity in livestock. So again, this applies sort of a bit more to internal parasites. But in order for animals to get natural immunity to these organisms, they need some level of exposure. So sort of treating and preventing any exposure to pests and parasites will prevent that natural immunity that livestock build up over their life. And then thirdly, the wasted money. So as I mentioned, we don't really need to treat the whole herd. We can save money by just focusing on animals that really need it. Then we have negative environmental impacts. So these insecticidal products are obviously designed to be insecticidal. They work very well. However, when we treat animals, they pass through the animal and they're not broken down. So they come out the other end in the manure and they are still insecticidal when they're out on the pasture in the manure. So we know that 90% of the dose can be excreted in the manure, largely unchanged. And if you remember back to that dung ecosystem I showed you, that has toxic impacts on these beneficial dung insects that are so important for the ecosystem. And then finally, organic producers are obviously very restricted in what they can use. So it's important that we're sort of thinking about alternative strategies. So just wanted to talk a bit about the different products and what we know about their impacts on beneficial insects. So with ivermectin and pyrethroids, so pyrethroids is, I mentioned commonly used fly sprays and pour-ons such as Ultrabos. We've known really since the 1980s that those products are toxic to beneficial dung insects on pastures. Later research has sort of tested different products, and we now know that moxidectin, so cydectin there, has much less toxic impact. So that is a good choice if you are thinking about sort of conserving beneficial insects on your pastures. It still has some impact, but nowhere near the level that those other insecticides do. Insect growth regulators, there really hasn't been much research on the impacts of those on beneficial insects. So that is things like Clarifly, for example, which is used as a feed additive to treat pest flies. And we have been doing some research on that over the past sort of year or two. So I just want to show you some of the results that we have found testing insect growth regulators. So we worked with 25 farms in Vermont and New York State. And some of those farms used these feed-through insecticides, so Clarifly, for example, for fly control. And another group of farms did not use those insecticides. We worked with farms that used insect growth regulators, so that's Clarifly, and ones that use organophosphates, so that's like Rabon. This figure just shows the insect growth regulators. And we did pest fly monitoring on those farms and also dung beetle sampling over the grazing season. So if we just look at this figure, the top two graphs here show dung beetle abundance in the first one, and then dung beetle species richness. So species richness just means how many different species of dung beetles there were, whereas the abundance is the total number of dung beetles. Along the bottom, these were the farms that used no insect growth regulators, and these were the farms that did. And we can see that there were significantly fewer dung beetles and significantly fewer species of dung beetles on the farms that used the feed-through insect growth regulators. When we looked at the pest flies, we also found significantly reduced pest fly populations as well on those farms. But that's just an indication that the continued use of these products could actually be damaging dung beetle populations. And then this grazing season just gone, we wanted to look at the impacts of insect growth regulators on the larval development of beneficial dung insects. And that is because these insecticides are designed so that they target pest fly larvae in the manure. So they are known not to kill the adult insects. And because of that, it was thought that they probably have less environmental impact because they're not killing adults of beneficial insects. But we sort of hypothesized that because they are larvicidal, they were probably also impacting the larval development of beneficial insects. So we did this mesocosm study, which just means a load of buckets, basically. And we filled them with sand and then put manure on top of each. And we had manure that was from cows that had been treated with different products. We had the insect growth regulators, the organophosphates, pyrethroids, and then no treatments at all. And we looked at fly emergence from these manure patties and also dung insect development within those buckets. We are still analysing the results from this. We've only just begun, really, but I wanted to just mention a key finding that's really stood out. So parasitoid wasps, which you might have heard called fly predators, they are beneficial insects that are natural enemies of pest flies. I'll just show you these pictures first. So they will basically lay, the parasitoid wasp will lay its egg in a pest fly pupae, and then the wasp larvae will consume the pest fly larvae, and a parasitoid wasp will hatch out instead of a pest fly. So they're really effective at controlling pest fly populations. And when we were sort of going through all the insects that we found in these buckets, we had lots of fly pupae, and you can see in this picture on the right, this is a normal fly puparium with a pest fly inside. This is face fly. And you can see like the butt of the fly sticking out and the legs there. So we found lots of those. And then we also found, so this is a pest fly puparium, but inside, when we opened it, there was not a fly, there was these parasitoid wasps. So this is a fly puparium that's been parasitized by these beneficial insects, which are helping to control fly populations. So if I just go back to this figure, this shows the number of parasitized fly pupae that we found in the manure from the different treatments. And as you can see, the manure that contained the feed-through insecticides pretty much had no parasitized fly pupae. So that means that these products are actually damaging parasitoid wasps in our pastures, and that is taking away a really important sort of natural enemy and natural sort of checks and balances on fly populations, which is obviously counterproductive to our goal of sort of controlling pest flies with these products. So yeah, all of this is kind of to say that there's this negative feedback loop of sort of the more treatments that we use, the more resistance we see in pest and parasite populations. The more pests and parasites there are, the more treatments we use. That means that there's going to be fewer of these beneficial insects, and again, leading to more pests and parasites. So we really want to break out of this cycle. And conventional chemical treatments focus on breaking these transmission cycles on or in the animal itself. So we're generally treating the animal with these products. IPM sort of involves thinking about how we can break transmission cycles of pests and parasites somewhere else, so out on the pasture, in the manure itself, or elsewhere in the pasture, by some of these methods, such as conserving dung beetles and releasing natural enemies such as parasitoid wasps, or other things such as trapping and botanical repellents. So the practices that we are thinking about with IPM, so as I mentioned before, monitoring is really important, looking for the presence and severity of infection. You can also look at sort of body condition scoring. Is there hair loss? Has there been scratching? Can I see actual, here there's ticks, for example. And then, as I mentioned, thinking about economic thresholds or action thresholds. So yes, I can see pests or parasites, but are they at a level where I need to do something about it? For external pests and parasites, there's various alternative treatments. I mentioned essential oils a few times, and I'll talk a bit more about, we've done some tests on some of these products, and botanical treatments, trapping, and so biological control as well. And so I'm going to talk about the effectiveness of some of these methods and how we've been testing them in our research over the past sort of 4 to 5 years. So that's what I'll move on to do for the last part of this talk now. So we'll begin with our pest fly research. So we did this in 2024. We worked with farms across Vermont and New York State. Some of those farms were organic and some of them were conventionally managed. And we did fly counts on the grazing cattle every other week over the grazing season. And these farms were using different control strategies for pest flies. So I'll show you what they were in some of the next slides in our results. At each visit, we recorded the numbers of horn flies, face flies, and stable flies on 10 randomly selected animals from the herd. And we also recorded farm management and sort of weather and temperature data too. So looking at the results here, first I just wanted to show you organic compared to conventional farms. So these figures, this one shows horn flies and this one shows face flies. We have the fly abundance up the side, and then whether the farm was organic or not along the bottom. You can see that there were significantly more horn flies and significantly more face flies on organic farms compared to conventional farms. And then I've labeled the economic thresholds on here in that gold bar. So for dairy, that is 50 horn flies per side of the animal. For beef, it's 100. And then for face flies, it's 10 flies per face for both production systems. And we can see that the economic thresholds are exceeded more often on organic farms too. And this just highlights sort of the challenges that organic producers face with treating and controlling pest flies. So now I wanted to look at just the organic farms and the treatment control practices that they were using. So this figure is just horn flies, and there were farms that used no fly control methods. Then there were farms that used essential oils as repellents. And then there were farms that released parasitoid wasps, so those fly predators, as natural enemies. And you can see here that there were significantly fewer horn flies on cows on farms that were using essential oils and on the farms that were using parasitoid wasps compared to the farms that were not using any fly management. So that's quite encouraging, and it shows that some of these alternative management practices are effective at reducing horn fly abundances. However, when we look at face flies and stable flies, the numbers of face flies and stable flies were not significantly reduced on farms that were using either of those alternative treatments. As I mentioned, face flies can be harder to control. And yeah, for stable flies, it's not too concerning because the numbers are generally below economic thresholds regardless. But as you can see, for face flies, the populations there are generally above economic thresholds. So that's really a challenge that we need to think about going forward. Looking at the conventional farms, so these farms were either using no-fly treatments, they were using Clarifly, so the feed-through insect growth regulator, or the common pyrethroid sprays and porons. And you can see that the feed-through insect growth regulator significantly reduced horn flies and face flies on cattle. However, farms using pyrethroid sprays or porons, there was no significant reduction in either of those flies. So that kind of indicates that there might be resistance developing to those common treatments. And then for stable flies, both of those treatment methods seem to reduce the populations. I just wanted to mention the impact of grazing management on these fly populations. So the farms that we were working at used different grazing strategies. So some were using continuous grazing, some were rotational, and some were management intensive rotational. And then here we have a label saying barn, and that was just if the cows were in the barn when we went to do the surveys. So we can see that there's significantly fewer horn flies and face flies on cows when they're in the barn compared to when they're out grazing. There were also fewer flies on cows that were rotationally grazing compared to cows that were continuously grazing. That's interesting. It's not something we've really seen before. Flies are excellent dispersers. Obviously, they can just sort of follow the animals around a rotation. So it wasn't necessarily expected that we would find this, but it's interesting and encouraging if rotational grazing can help to reduce fly burdens. And then unsurprisingly, there were more stable flies when cows were inside the barn. As I mentioned, they prefer sort of a housing environment. So just wanted to mention this setup that was on one of the farms that we worked at. This is a sort of a mobile cattle self-groomer scratcher. And in this tank here, the farmer had put essential oil repellent. So that tank sort of wicks the treatment out onto the brushes, and the cows can just like treat themselves essentially while they're scratching away. Essential oils are effective, they just evaporate very quickly. So you have to sort of keep applying them every couple of hours, which is not convenient. However, this method meant the cows were just applying it to themselves. They loved using this. You can see them kind of queuing up to use it. And the farmer had also got the mineral feeder there, and this whole thing can be dragged around as they move through the rotation. So that seemed like a really great setup. We also found a lot of tabanids, so that's horseflies and deer flies. They're pretty nasty. They have quite primitive mouth parts where they sort of slash the skin and then lap the blood up. You can see the blood dripping down. So they can be quite bothersome and painful for cattle. We did sort of a mini test between some of these fly traps, and we found that the horsepower was really effective and was really quite a cost-effective and low maintenance way of controlling horseflies and deer flies. So yeah, the key messages from the pest fly work was that with no fly management strategies, the economic thresholds for face flies are generally exceeded. And on organic farms, that's also true for horn flies. However, essential oil treatments and parasitoid wasps, or those fly predators, did seem to be effective at reducing horn flies. However, strategies for face fly control are desperately needed. Putting the cows in the barn is a very effective way to reduce fly pressure. So that obviously applies more for dairy. If it's really hot or if it's a really bad fly day, you can just keep the cows in the barn that day. And that can give them a nice break from the flies. And cows grazing rotationally seem to have reduced fly pressure compared to continuously grazed animals. And resistance to pyrethroid treatments might be being observed in Vermont and New York State fly populations. Okay, I think I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to briefly talk about our tick study. So we worked with 20 farms across Vermont and New York State for this. It's about half and half beef and dairy. And we sampled ticks on the vegetation every other week between the months of May and November. And we sampled ticks using this cloth drag method, where you basically drag a white cloth through the vegetation, and the ticks will latch onto it because they think it's a passing animal, and then you can sort of flip it over and count the ticks that have attached there. And we were comparing different habitats, so the grazed pasture itself, and then edge habitat where the woodland meets the pasture, brush, so sort of scrubby areas, and then in the woods as well. We only found 3 species of tick in this study. We found the American dog tick, so we found that was very common and widespread. It was more associated with the edge habitat, so sort of scrubby, brushy areas where woodland meets pasture, and general sort of shrubby areas. Interestingly, we found it frequently on farms that had ponds or bodies of water, so there seemed to be an association there. And we found that the adults were active in the spring and the summer, but not in the fall. And we only found adults of this species. Then we also found the black-legged or deer tick, very, very commonly. However, this tick was more associated with the woodland areas, so inside the trees, as opposed to sort of in more exposed areas. And we found all life stages, so adults, nymphs, and larvae. The adults were active in the spring and then again in the fall, whereas the nymphs and the larvae were found more over the summer. And then we did find the Asian longhorn tick. That was found on 2 farms in New York State, and it was very, very abundant on those 2 farms. So it was mostly immature stages, so nymphs and larvae that were found, and a smaller number of adult females later in the summer. And there was only a single male recorded in the whole study. As I mentioned, that tick does not need to mate. It just reproduces as the female can lay viable eggs. And that's why the populations can build up so quickly. And that was associated with open pasture. So it's really the only tick that we found in any abundance sort of in the actual pasture itself. As I said, Cassandra Olds is going to do a more detailed talk on ticks, but I'm sure you're interested in the Asian longhorn tick. So I just have some figures here showing its spread into the Northeast. We did not find it in any of our Vermont farms. It has not reached Vermont yet, as far as we know. It was found in Ulster County and Westchester County in New York in our study. And just one of those farms in Ulster County had Theileria present, so that's the disease that it transmits. Okay, so the last thing I'm going to talk about is lice. Hopefully I won't go over time here. So as I mentioned, lice are a big issue in the winter. So after the animals come in from the pastures, they're in housing for a bit, the lice numbers can really explode sort of as we're going into, they sort of build up and can get really, really high in sort of January, February time. So we wanted to test an essential oil-based treatment for lice. Essential oils are botanical insecticides. So they're basically secondary metabolites that are produced by the plant in order to stop insects from eating the plant. And they're usually neurotoxic to insects. So we created this formulation that was lavender, clove, and thyme essential oils in a mineral oil base. And we tested this in the lab, first of all. So we basically collected lice from cows, took them to the lab and put them on a Petri dish with the treatment on. And we found that it was 97 to 100% effective at killing lice in the lab. So we then did a big study on a farm where we applied a litre of our formulation to adult cows, less to smaller animals and calves. But we used a sort of pour-on method where we just poured it along the back midline and then brushed it in a bit. And we did 2 applications of it 2 weeks apart. And this figure shows how effective it was. So we counted lice on the cows sort of before and after we treated them. This shows the lice abundance on the cows and then just the treatment session between November and March, so over the winter. We had 2 groups of cows. So one barn had the cow-calf group in, that's shown on blue, in blue here. And then the other barn had the steers in, and that's shown in red. So at the beginning of the winter, we decided just to treat the cow-calf barn with our formulation. We treated them twice, and as you can see, there was no lice recorded as we go into winter, whereas we did not treat the steer barn, and the lice numbers really built up as we go into winter there. Later in the winter, we decided to switch and we treated the steer barn that already had these populations of lice. And you can see that after we treated them, the lice numbers dropped to essentially 0, whereas we did not treat the cow-calf barn in blue here. And as you can see, their lice numbers really exploded later into the winter. So this formulation was effective at preventing infestation early in the winter, as well as treating heavy infestation of established lice. So we wanted to see if the cows could use that groomer scratcher that I showed you for the pest flies in the barn and use it with our essential oil formulation in for lice. The cows, again, loved it. They loved applying it to themselves. It's great at reducing the time and labor costs of treating the animals, and it did suppress the lice numbers. It was not as effective as the just pouring it on strategy. So I think the best practice for this method would be a combination. So setting up this groomer scratcher in the barn, allowing the cows to sort of keep lice numbers down themselves, but then also monitoring the animals and treating any individuals that seem to need it using the pour-on technique. Okay, that's the end. I just wanted to finish with one slide thinking about dung beetle friendly practices. So dung beetles need dung out there so that they can survive. So first and foremost, grazing animals and grazing them for as long as possible. Dung beetles will be around surprisingly sort of early in the spring and also later on into the fall. So if we can sort of maximize the grazing season, doesn't need to be the whole herd, but even just having some animals out there to provide resources for dung beetles is going to support their populations. Obviously, minimizing the use of pesticides and insecticides, as we've discussed throughout this talk. The best way to do that is to use these IPM methods for control. And then finally, thinking about integrating woodland habitat, we know that many of the species of dung beetle that we find in the Northeast are introduced species from Europe. They're still very important and provide all of those ecosystem services. But things we can do to support the native dung beetle species here, they are known to be more associated with woodland. So just integrating some trees can support our native dung beetle species too. Okay, that's it. Thank you very much for listening. And if anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
That was excellent, Barney. Thank you. Um, so we have one question here. It says, are there any seasonal trends to different varieties of lice?
Um, not not particularly within the sort of general, they will be found in the winter that I know of. They basically can't survive ultraviolet radiation. They hate sunlight. They have very specific temperature ranges, which is around the body temperature of the animal. So any sort of exposure to heat and sunlight, they hate it. So it is generally in the winter that we find all of these species popping up.
I had a question. I noticed one management technique I've suggested in the past is to drag a pasture. Would you be recommending something like that, or is that more detrimental to the beneficials as well?
Yeah, that is not something I would recommend. It is detrimental to all of those beneficial dung insects. And I have also seen studies showing that it actually doesn't really reduce fly populations. I
Mm.
think they're less picky about, they can probably just breed in clumps of broken up dung anyway. So I don't think the cost benefit of that really works out.
There is another question. Before I get to that, there is a survey in the chat if on the actual meeting if you could fill that out. We'll also email it out to you if you don't have time to do that. It's not very long. Um, here's a question. Any research on the effectiveness of topical iodine to kill flies and or lice?
Not that I know of, no. Um, yeah, I can't really speak to that.
Was there any other question? Oh, here. Can you share where you buy how to make the groomer scratcher?
Yeah, I can, maybe I'll share, maybe we could send out an email with a link to where you can get that. I think it's about $500. So not cheap, but also not extortionate.
So there is another, potentially we're going to be testing this in the Northeast. There's a thing called the CalVac, and it's like a cattle chute that the cattle, it's been mostly associated with dairy farms, that actually suck the flies, the horn flies off the animals. Um, it was being sold by Spalding Labs. They stopped selling it, but hopefully somebody will pick that up. And that is pretty effective at controlling, very effective actually at controlling horn flies. So it actually can reduce the population on a farm. So, and it's a non-pesticide way of doing it. We will have this. I'll be posting this on our YouTube page. If you look up Cornell IPM, um, we can you can view it. I don't know, Bryony. Someone's asking if you would share the slides, possibly. If you're an
Yeah,
extension person, I would think that's fine. So,
yeah, I think that would be fine.
any other questions? All right. Oh, wait, we did. How did you decide which essential oils are effective? What about those plants that are particularly toxic to parasites?
Yeah, so we based our formulation on basically there's a lot of research into botanical insecticides, and we wanted to pick the ones that had published effectiveness that were most effective at killing insects, but also had like the least mammalian toxicity, so that there would be no risk to the cows. I did some previous work before coming to Vermont on that, and we also used like other published work. But there is, as you've said, there's thousands of botanical insecticides that could be candidates. And I just think, yeah, it's a matter of sort of trying them out and deciding which ones you prefer, whilst also thinking about are they sort of going to irritate a mammal or not?
Great. Are there any other questions? All
Looks
right.
like
Well,
there's one more question. Someone
oh,
asked, what was the ratio between essential oils and the carrier oil?
sorry.
Yeah, so I think the total percentage of essential oils was something like 7.5%, and the rest was mineral oil. So it was quite small. I can't remember the actual volumes because we were mixing up different amounts. But I could also, if people are interested, I could also send out some information on that.
Dylan makes a good point here. So we're kind of revamping our veterinary entomology information on the web. And if you happen to have any good pictures of any of this stuff, we'll give you credit for them on a publication. Really, we have a lice publication that's coming out. We could really get some good if someone could have a picture of them, calling for them, and it'll be nice to put that in there, or any other pest related type of thing. If you want to send it to me, we can integrate them into our fact sheets that we're putting together at the moment. We have several of them, mostly in sheep and goats and swine at the moment, but the cattle one should be coming out sometime this year. It's been done for a couple of years now, so I don't know what's taking it, but it is kind of there ready to go. So there's another question. Also, where would we find information that you will be sharing in our emails or on our websites? Does that know?
Yeah, we have all of your emails.
Yeah.
We'll send a
Yeah.
follow-up with all of the information.
Good. Yeah, good point. We have email for everybody that registered, so we'll send you out all that information. Anything else? All right. Well, thank you again, Bryony. That was great. We'll see
Thank you.
We'll see you again next week, eh? So
Yeah. Okay.
bye.